So let's start with the question about the costs of digital preservation. Some of you will be aware that a few years ago, the DPC and other partners, some of you in the room, were involved in a project called the 4C project. The collaboration to clarify the cost of curation. There you go. You wouldn't get that immediately off the first time. So we worked hard in that project to establish methodologies and tools and approaches to how we figure out the costs of curation. And among the tools and the ideas that emerged from that project was a thing called the Curation Costs Exchange. And we're going to hear more about that this afternoon, aren't we, Sarah? And the question keeps arising, how much will digital preservation cost? So as a little thought experiment, a couple of months ago, Sarah put together some outputs from the Curation Costs Exchange to see what they might tell us about the costs of digital preservation. Now, the curation, without wanting to take Sarah's thunder from later, the Curation Costs Exchange allows us to gather information from many different parties as to how much they're spending on digital preservation activities. And it's a very diverse mix. So in a strange way, we can actually be very precise based on a very global average or a very wide data set as to how much it costs to do digital preservation. So on the absolute condition that none of you tweet this or represent this information outside the room, if you look deep into the Curation Costs Exchange, we can tell you how much it costs per gigabyte, or how much it's costing agencies per gigabyte per year to do digital preservation. So if you look at a per gigabyte per year cost, €152.64 to look after a gigabyte of data. Now, I'm not really going to attach much importance to that figure because it's a very strange measure of central tendency based on a very complex statistical data set that needs properly understood. What I simply want to observe is that's an awful lot more money than it costs to go and buy a terabyte of storage at Tesco. So there's a big difference between what we're talking about in digital preservation and what you would call the commodity costs or the consumer costs of data storage. And I think we understand why that is. We understand why that is. We understand that because of all the many different logical and functional processes that we add about authenticity and data management. And yet this is a really difficult, this comes to the core, I think, of some of the arguments we need to have in the context of digital preservation and the nature of the advocacy we need to undertake with senior management. And as a reminder, I'm a fan of this observation from David Rosenthal, slightly dated now, but still I think it holds true, that of all the things we've worried about in digital preservation, about file formats, about media obsolescence, about all the many different issues of authenticity, actually, do you know what? It's money that turns out to be the significant challenge to our digital heritage. Let me give you that as a practical example. So in my life, I have established 2 repositories. One digital repository, one physical repository. I worked at the Archaeology Data Service as it was being set up. A few years later, I moved back home to the city of Glasgow, where I was involved in building a physical repository, the Glasgow Museum's Resources Centre, which is a museum repository for hard objects. You know, it's a kind of repository, if you stub your toe against it, it hurts, because it's made of concrete and steel. Now, the setup costs for the Archaeology Data Service, funded initially by JISC, and then also by the AHRB, and I use that advisedly, AHRB, was, is 2.5 members of staff and a server. So the setup costs tens of thousands of pounds. The setup cost for the Glasgow Museum's Resources Centre, on the other hand, is tens of millions of pounds. And it seems to me a strange thing. On one hand, remember that archaeologists, there's a few of us in the room, archaeologists are the single biggest threat to the historic environment, because there's nothing an archaeologist likes more than systematically dismantling the archaeological record. It's called excavation. And consequently, the records that generate from the archaeological excavation, that's all that survives in many cases. And in the digital age, all that survives, therefore, is the digital record. And there's therefore quite a lot of value, in a research sense, to the digital materials going into the archaeology data service. And yet, it's a complicated, ongoing argument to try and get a small piece of investment to keep that repository in business. And Julian Richards at the ADS has done a tremendous job over the years of making the case for that funding, but it's not an easy process at all. Set up tens of thousands of pounds. Set up for Glasgow Museum's Resource Centre, tens of millions of pounds. And let's be frank about it, this is not a wealthy city. So this is a not very wealthy city spending tens of millions of pounds to look after its museum collection. And this isn't HLF funded, it's not externally funded, this is coming through the city's own taxpayers. So it's coming from the tax base of the city. Why is it possible to spend tens of millions of pounds on that? Well, for my money, it's because the people of the city of Glasgow understands the value of its museum collection. So the museum collection, as you may not know this, Glasgow has the second largest civic museum collection in Europe. And it's valued for insurance purposes in billions of pounds. It's valued for insurance purposes at more than the housing stock of the city. And in that environment, okay, maybe not the claim it used to be, but in that environment, the case for making an investment in tens of millions of pounds is fairly straightforward, because we understand the value of the collection. And I think that's the point I'm trying to get to in terms of making the case and presenting the cost of digital preservation. These aren't really a direct comparison, it's the thought or the conceptual space that they occupy that I want to draw your attention to. And they come to the kind of key point here. Is digital preservation expensive? Well, for me, it needn't be expensive, but in too many cases it's an unfunded mandate. So we're trying to do digital preservation as a project, and all the time recognizing that it's a long-term commitment. Digital preservation is not a project, it is a long-term commitment. And in terms of funding, what we need, therefore, isn't capital spend. Although capital spend is always welcome, what we actually need is ongoing flows of revenue spend that will sustain it not as a project, but as the ongoing commitment which we understand it to be. Let's observe from the lived experience of digital preservation the cost of doing preservation can vary with time. So I want you to imagine a very simple digitization project timeline and a kind of life cycle of digital objects in a digitization project. Here's a kind of diagram you can make on a train on your way to a meeting. So imagine this is a digitization project, but it could be any kind of business process. Let's just use digitization as a common language. We do some data capture, we do some processing, we add value through metadata, we aggregate it with other materials, we provide some sort of delivery platform, we deliver it out, and through that life cycle, after a certain point in time, it will start to become obsolete, and the value will then be lost. But through that life cycle, we're releasing value all the way through. Now the question to me arises of what is the right time to introduce digital preservation? The cost of introducing digital preservation is going up the longer we leave it. So for long enough, the argument has to have been made that if we want to plan digital preservation, where do we plan it? Do we plan it at the end of digital object life cycles? Do we plan it at the end of a business process life cycle? No, we plan it at the start because that's the cheaper way to do it. That's how we can afford to do it. And for long enough, therefore, I've been saying preservation from the outset, preservation at the point of creation of our digital objects. And there's some truth in that, but actually, I think in the big scheme of things, we could make a better argument. I think I have been wrong. What I'd like to propose is that we have this kind of digitization project, but we also, that sits within a wider business process or project life cycle, which has its own life cycle stages, about scoping, about initiating work, about doing, say, pilot projects, about attempting to bring together the funding, scoping work, and then initiating, delivering some sort of business process. In this case, a digitization project. And the same holds true. So the cost to introduce preservation thinking increases the longer you leave it. So the question about cost of digital preservation isn't simply a question of how much does it cost, it's also a question of when are we going to take that decision, when are we going to make that commitment, and who is making that commitment? Because if we leave it to the archivists, at at the end of the life cycle, we're leaving it to the point in the life cycle which is already agreed to be the most expensive. So the question therefore arises about how we engage at a much different point in our business process life cycles to ensure infrastructure that's preservation ready. So can we build infrastructures? Can we build corporate strategies? Can we build digital preservation into our objectives as an organisation more effectively? Let me observe some problems in trying to achieve that. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples of trying to speak digital preservation in corporate language. And I'm going to talk first about tangible versus intangible assets. So, my favourite worked example, but there are many more. Some of you heard me on this before. When Facebook was sold on the market, when Facebook shares went on the market, you've got the figures in front of you here. The Facebook Corporation had a cash value, actual value of the company, of what it owned and its assets were $6.3 billion US. That's a lot of money. That's a big corporation. But look what happened at the share valuation stage. At the point it went on the market for sale, it accumulated something like $100 billion US in value because the share valuation was $104 billion. And somewhere in there, there are what can only be intangible assets, something that the market is recognizing as having value, but we're not sure what it is. And the argument seems to me to follow that what is the intangible asset in Facebook? It's the data. So we have data value that's something around $100 billion US. Interesting, because the production cost for Facebook of that is almost nil. And that is the business plan for the future, ladies and gentlemen. Get everyone else to make your product for you. I'm being facetious. Tangible versus intangible assets. So let's drill a bit more deeply into this. And I've been trying, some of you know I've been trying this slightly obscure little piece of work lately to talk about tangible and intangible assets in a meaningful sense. Now, digital assets are understood by company auditors, by accountants, as intangible assets. That's to say they are not tangible assets of the company, they fall into a different category alongside things like goodwill or patents, intellectual property. It has that characteristic in company accounts. And it falls under, those of you will know this already, it falls under International Accounting Standard 38. IAS 38 is how we describe intangible assets. And for me the question arises, if we could make digital assets, tangible assets, and we could put them on the balance sheet of the company, somehow people would take an awful lot more concern and care over them. So what do we need to do? How do we need to address ourselves to that family of regulation and thinking and standard in order to put digital assets into a different place in terms of our kind of corporate governance? So looking at IAS 38 turns out to be quite an important piece of work. And I've been trying to speak to the kind of audit profession around that. Let me observe though that IAS 38 was launched in 1997. It was launched in the same month as the very first MP3 player was launched on the commercial market. First consumer MP3 player, the Diamond Pro, whatever it is, Rio Pro. I think there has been quite a lot of change in the music industry since the first MP3 player was launched. I also think there's been quite a lot of change in the importance and use and vitality of digital materials in that period. And I think, therefore, that it's time not only to recognise that the original MP3 player is probably obsolete, perhaps the accounting standard that we've been working to is also itself in need of some repair, so that auditors can tell the difference in terms of assessing digital assets between properly organised, maintained, trusted digital repositories and digital landfill. Because what we do as a preservation profession, or as an archive profession, is to develop materials that can be useful, accessible, and valuable through time. note about cyber insurance. There is a cyber insurance market, and if you want to insure your company, insure your assets, digital assets also, you can take out insurance against cyber hacking. And this is, we're getting kind of low down into sort of some of the actuarial and insurance kind of thinking, but here are the sorts of equations, the sorts of basis upon which an insurance premium would be based. So your annualized loss expectancy is a function of your annual rate of occurrence and the single loss expectancy. So you can work out, those of you who have done risk management will begin to see in here impact and probability scores coming up. The single loss expectancy, so what would be the expecting cost of a particular moment of loss, is a combination of the asset value and the exposure factor. The asset value being what's the value of the asset that's being protected, the exposure factor, how much of that asset is at risk. And it seems to me that no matter how we approach the question, whether from the question of accountancy and intangible assets, or from the question of cybersecurity, we keep coming back to this question of how do we calculate confidently the value of an asset. That's what brings us here today. Can we explore and develop some of those issues more meaningfully? Do we even know the right questions we need to be asking? That's all I wanted to say by way of introduction. I feel now I should ask again, does anyone want to be at a different show today? Maybe what I could do, rather than doing questions at this point, is just invite Paul from JISC, because we're here today with JISC sponsorship, JISC support, to discuss these matters in the context of work that JISC is leading.
I get a handheld microphone because I'm not special, and I get to stand there when that one. That's right. And click on the. Okay. A few thoughts about underlying things we might want to consider today. Why are we doing this? Questions that underpin the whole of this concept of data and data value. Why are we preserving it? Someone told us to. What's it worth? Who should pay to keep it? And for me, the most important one, is it sustainable? Whatever way you're paying for it. And to paraphrase Jesse J, it is all about the money. Without the money, the whole thing grinds to a halt. As William rightly pointed out early on, David Rosenthal said a long time ago that money is the biggest problem. Some thoughts underlying that. If data is free or has no value, why are you preserving it? If it costs more to keep it than it's worth, why are you preserving it? If it costs more to keep it than the penalties for destroying it, why are you keeping it? And someone somewhere has taken the business decision to keep stuff because there's perceived value. But what is the value? Do they actually know? It's all saying we should keep things because it's our mandate. But if you don't know what the value is, how can you make a business case for keeping it? The data conundrum in a nutshell. There are a few things here. Again, things to underpin the thoughts you might have today. It costs value to make data, so therefore it has value, probably. How do you put a value on that? That's the difficult thing. It costs money to keep data. Yes, we all know that. Forecasting the future cost of data and the storage of that data, or the future value of data, is difficult. We've been trying to do that for a long time, and I think that we yet have come across a way of doing it that everyone accepts as being correct. There are risks associated with losing data and deleting data. We know that as well. Those risks, in theory, could have a monetary value placed upon them. Again, it's difficult to do that. Project funding is not a sustainable business model. We know that. And we say that over and over again, but still we come up with this whole concept of project funding, project funding. Government funding is not a sustainable business model. All it takes is a change of government, a change of priorities. Potholes are more important than data. Money goes, what happens then? and what happens when the money runs out. So those are some thoughts there. We're going to look today about some of the ways of putting value on the data and stuff as well. So some thoughts about the way you might want to do that. Whoops, too far. These are some ways that people have thought about deriving value from data. I'm not saying they're the only ways, but if you can add to this list, if you can think of ways to put actual numbers or equations against things that aren't on this list, are on this list, that would be a fantastic result. So just some thoughts there about things that underpin the conversation today.